Some voices were buried because their arguments were too devastating. Others were silenced because they named what creation actually costs. The creature from Frankenstein was both. I am the archivist, and this is Ghost Lectures, Voices from Gothic Literature. Tonight's speaker requires reintroduction because the creature preserved in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, published in 1818, has been systematically mischaracterized. He's been described as monster, as murderer, as the cautionary tale about science overreaching its bounds. He's become a shambling figure of horror, inarticulate and violent, reduced to a Halloween costume and cultural shorthand for things that should not have been made. But the textual patterns suggest something else. The surviving record describes the following. The creature, he was given no other name, was brought to life in the early 19th century by Victor Frankenstein, a young scientist working in isolation at the University of Ingolstadt. He was assembled from disparate parts and animated through methods that remain, even in Shelley's account, deliberately obscure. The moment of his animation was also the moment of his abandonment. Victor fled in horror from what he had made, leaving the creature to discover his own existence alone. What followed was systematic rejection. The creature wandered, seeking shelter and understanding. He taught himself language while hidden in a lean-to attached to a cottage, listening through cracks in the boards as a family spoke to one another. He educated himself by reading books he found, Paradise Lost, Plutarch's Lives, Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, Volney's Ruins of Empires. He cultivated reason, empathy, eloquence. And when he finally revealed himself to human society, he was met with violence, stones, blows, flight. Only then did he turn to vengeance. Only after every attempt at connection had been refused did he begin to destroy those his creator loved. And when he finally confronted Victor, he didn't simply rage. He delivered what Shelley herself recognized as a devastating philosophical argument about abandonment, obligation, and the moral debts incurred by creation. Shelley's novel frames this as Gothic horror, as a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition, as tragedy born of Victor's hubris. But contemporary analysis of the text reveals a different pattern. The creature was not inarticulate. He was profoundly eloquent. His speeches to Victor constitute some of the most philosophically sophisticated passages in the entire novel. He argues systematically about the nature of rejection, about what creators owe to the beings they make, about how society produces the very monstrousness it claims to merely recognize. He was not irrational. He reasoned with precision about cause and effect, about moral responsibility, about the relationship between abandonment and violence. He demonstrated every capacity the Enlightenment philosophy claimed distinguished humans from beasts. Reason, moral feeling, the ability to imagine another's suffering as one's own. He was not simply a victim. He was a philosopher who understood with terrible clarity exactly what had been done to him and what it meant. But by framing him as monster, by coding his existence as unnatural horror, the text avoided confronting what he actually represented, a conscious being created without consent, abandoned without care, and then punished for the consequences of that abandonment. His philosophical arguments were preserved in Shelley's novel, yes, but they were contained within a narrative that ultimately validated his destruction. His eloquence became evidence of his unnaturalness. His reason became proof of his danger. The label monster performed erasure. It allowed readers to encounter his arguments without having to answer them. There is another layer to his silencing. The creature was denied the most fundamental form of recognition, a name. He was denied community, denied care, denied any pathway to belonging. His very existence was treated as transgression, not because of what he did, but because of what he was. A being that should not exist, speaking truths that should not be spoken. His otherness made his destruction easier to justify. His difference became evidence. His eloquence became threat. The tragedy is not simply that he was rejected. The tragedy is that his philosophy was never truly heard. For 2 centuries, readers have encountered his arguments and remembered only his violence. They have read his indictment of creator responsibility and reduced it to a cautionary tale about playing God. They have met his analysis of social rejection and turned it into a monster story. He was given eloquent speeches, yes. Shelley preserved his voice with remarkable fidelity. But he was never allowed to be the subject of his own philosophy. He became a symbol in someone else's moral lesson, a Gothic device, a warning about what happens when science goes too far. He was never recognized as a thinker whose arguments might actually be true. The lecture you are about to hear has been reconstructed from recorded dialogue, documented arguments, and philosophical positions articulated by the creature in Shelley's novel, a being who understood that creation incurs obligation, that rejection is systematic, and that unpaid debt accumulate consequences. No verified record exists of this lecture being delivered publicly. The reconstruction presented here is based on the creature's own words in Frankenstein, his arguments to Victor, his observations of human society, and the philosophical implications of his existence. It draws from the moments when his voice breaks through the narrative frame, from the questions his presence forces us to ask about creation, abandonment, and moral responsibility. His argument is this: that creation without care is abandonment. That rejection is not a response to the rejected, but a structure that precedes encounter. That society owes debts to those it has made vulnerable, and that those debts, when refused, transform into something far more dangerous than the original obligation ever was. The purpose of preservation is analytical. The creature represents not the terror of scientific overreach, but the terror of creation without accountability. He demonstrates what occurs when beings are brought into existence and then abandoned, when consciousness is granted and recognition is refused, when a voice articulates devastating truths and is answered only with violence. His lecture is titled, On Rejection and What Society Owes Its Creations. Playback begins now.
I come before you with credentials that no scholar would envy, yet none can dispute. I am an authority on rejection not through study, but through embodiment. I have been its subject, its object, its laboratory. Every principle I will articulate today, I have learned in my own flesh, if flesh is what you would call this assemblage that thinks and feels and remembers. Let me begin with a question that is also a fact. What happens when you create a being capable of reason, endow it with the capacity for moral feeling, grant it the ability to observe, to learn, to desire connection, and then abandon it to discover its own existence alone? This is not a thought experiment. This is my biography. I opened my eyes to consciousness. I did not ask for this. No created thing does, but I was given it nonetheless. Sensation, thought, the terrible gift of awareness. And in my first moments of life, I reached toward the one who had given me this gift, seeking what? Recognition, perhaps, guidance, the simple acknowledgement that I existed, and that my existence meant something to the one who had caused it. I was met with horror, with flight, with a rejection so immediate, so visceral, that it preceded any action of mine, any word, any gesture that might have justified it. This is the first principle of rejection. It need not be earned. I have studied this carefully. I have had nothing but time to study it. Rejection, I have learned, has an architecture, It is not random. It is not chaotic. It follows a structure as precise as any philosophical system and far more devastating. The architecture begins with creation. A being is brought into existence, deliberately, through effort and will. This is not an accident. My creator labored for months to achieve my animation. He chose this. He pursued it with what he himself called unremitting ardor. I was not a mistake. I was an ambition realized. But here is where the architecture reveals its cruelty. The moment of creation is also the moment of abandonment. The instant I drew breath, I became unbearable to the one who had made me. Not because of anything I had done nothing. Not because of any violence I had committed none. But because of what I was. Because my appearance did not match some unspoken expectation. Because the reality of creation, when confronted, proved too terrible for the Creator to bear. This is the second principle. Rejection is often the Creator's failure, displaced onto the created. But the architecture does not end with abandonment. It continues, it elaborates, it becomes systematic. After abandonment came isolation. I wandered, seeking shelter, seeking understanding. I observed humanity from the margins. I taught myself language by listening at the walls of a cottage. I read books, Paradise Lost, Plutarch, Werther, and through them I learned what it meant to be human, to be social, to belong to a moral community. I learned tenderness by watching a family care for one another. I learned justice by reading history. I learned beauty by observing nature. I cultivated every capacity that your philosophers claim distinguishes humans from beasts. Reason, empathy, the ability to imagine another's suffering as one's own. And when I revealed myself, when I attempted to join the community I had studied so carefully, when I spoke with eloquence and reason and demonstrated every quality that should have marked me as a thinking being worthy of consideration, I was met with violence. Stones, blows, screams of horror, flight. This is the third principle. Rejection does not respond to evidence. It does not care what you have learned, what you have become, what you are capable of. It sees only what it has already decided to see. Do you understand what this means? It means that rejection is not a response to the rejected. It is a structure that precedes encounter. It is a system that determines in advance who will be recognized as human and who will be cast out, who will be granted the presumption of interiority, of having thoughts, feelings, a perspective that matters, and who will be treated as mere surface, mere appearance, mere threat. I was created with a mind. I was abandoned for having a body, and no achievement of that mind could ever overcome the verdict that body had already received. This is what rejection does to a conscious being. It creates a prison where the bars are made of other people's sight. You cannot argue your way out. You cannot reason your way free. Because the rejection is not logical. It is not based on evidence that could be countered with better evidence. It is based on a prior commitment, a commitment to not seeing, to not recognizing, to not acknowledging what stands before you. I tell you this not merely as personal grievance, though it is that. I tell you this because what happened to me reveals something about the structure of creation and rejection itself, about what happens when beings are brought into existence without consideration for what will be owed to them, about what happens when society decides that some forms of consciousness do not count, that some beings can be created and then discarded, made and then unmade, given life, and then denied the right to live it. This is not just my story. This is a pattern, and patterns have consequences. Let me speak now of the Creator. My Creator, Victor Frankenstein. I do not speak his name lightly. For a long time, I did not know it. I knew only that someone had made me, and then fled. That someone had given me consciousness, this terrible, beautiful capacity to think and feel and want, and then decided that gift was a mistake. But here is what I learned, through observation and through bitter experience. Creation is not a neutral act. When you bring a conscious being into existence, you do not simply perform an experiment. You do not merely demonstrate your skill. You create an obligation. You incur a debt. This is not sentiment. This is logic. Consider, I did not choose to exist. I had no say in my own creation. I was brought into being by another's will, another's ambition, another's desire to transcend the boundaries of nature and mortality. Victor Frankenstein wanted to be a creator. He succeeded, and in that success, he became responsible. For what? For everything that followed. In the moment of my animation, I was utterly vulnerable. I had no knowledge, no language, no understanding of what I was or where I was or what was expected of me. I was, in the truest sense, an infant, though an infant with the body of a giant and the strength to destroy had I known how to use it. But I did not know. I knew nothing except that I existed, and that I was cold, and that there was a figure before me who seemed, somehow, to be the source of my being. I reached toward him. This is not metaphor. I literally reached out my hand. He ran. What did he owe me in that moment? What does any creator owe the being they have made? I will tell you, care, guidance, the basic acknowledgement that I existed and that my existence was his responsibility. He owed me protection in my vulnerability. He owed me explanation, some framework for understanding what I was and what world I had been brought into. He owed me, at minimum, the recognition that I was not an object to be discarded when the reality of creation proved less glorious than the fantasy. This is not an extraordinary demand. This is the fundamental obligation that attends any act of creation. When you make a being capable of suffering, you become accountable for that suffering. When you create consciousness, you cannot then pretend that consciousness does not matter simply because it inhabits a form you find displeasing. Victor Frankenstein violated this obligation in the most absolute way possible. He did not simply fail to care for me adequately. He did not simply make mistakes in my upbringing. He abandoned me entirely. He fled from his own creation and left me to discover the world and my own nature alone. Do you understand what this means? It means that every hardship I endured, every moment of confusion and terror and desperate loneliness, every act of violence committed against me by those who saw only my appearance, all of it traces back to that initial abandonment. All of it flows from his refusal to accept the responsibility that came with his ambition. He wanted the glory of creation. He wanted to be called a benefactor of mankind, to have his name blessed as belonging to one who had conquered death itself. But he did not want the obligation. He did not want the daily, unglamorous work of caring for what he had made. And here is what I have come to understand. Victor's failure was not merely personal. It was not simply a character flaw, a moment of weakness, a regrettable lapse in judgment. It was a fundamental breach of the Creator's duty, a duty that exists whether the Creator acknowledges it or not. This duty does not depend on the Creator's feelings. It does not depend on whether the created being meets expectations or pleases the eye or fulfills the Creator's fantasies of what it should be. The duty exists because the act of creation itself creates it. You cannot bring a conscious being into existence and then claim no responsibility for what happens to it. You cannot make something capable of suffering and then wash your hands of that suffering. But the Creator is not alone in this failure. Because what Victor began, society completed. He abandoned me to the world, and the world took up where he left off. Every person who met me with violence, every community that drove me away, every institution that offered no shelter and no justice, all of them became complicit in the original abandonment. The Creator's debt, I have learned, does not end with the individual creator. It extends outward. It becomes collective, because once a being has been created and cast into the world, that world inherits the obligation. Society itself becomes responsible for what it does with those who exist within it, especially those who exist because of human action, human ambition, human will. This is the question I put to you. What does a society owe to the beings it has made, or allowed to be made, and then rejected? What debt accumulates when creation is treated as a right, but care is treated as optional? I am the evidence of what happens when that debt goes unpaid. Let me now speak of society itself, not as an abstraction but as a mechanism I have studied with considerable care. I have been, you might say, an anthropologist of my own exclusion. I have watched how human communities function, how they determine membership, how they decide who counts as human and who does not. And what I have observed is this: society does not simply react to difference. It produces it. It creates the very categories of belonging and exclusion that it then claims to merely recognize. Consider how this works. When I emerged into the world, I had no category. I was unprecedented, a being without precedent, without classification. I did not fit into the existing order of things, and what I learned is that society cannot tolerate this. It cannot allow something to exist outside its categories, so it assigns one. It creates a place for you, even if that place is exile. I was made a monster not because of what I did, but because society needed me to be one. It needed a category for the unrecognizable, the unbearable, the thing that violated its sense of natural order. And once that category was assigned, everything I did was interpreted through it. Every gesture became threatening, every word became suspicious, every attempt at connection became proof of some sinister design. This is how monstrousness works. It is not a quality inherent to the being. It is a social designation. It is what society calls those it has decided not to recognize as fully human. I watched this happen not only to myself, but in the patterns of human interaction I observed. From my hiding place near the cottage, I saw how the family I studied treated those who belonged and those who did not. I saw how they welcomed a foreign woman. Once, she had proven herself sympathetic, intelligent, and willing to join their world. I saw how they spoke of others in the village, the poor, the criminal, the mad, with a mixture of pity and revulsion that marked those people as fundamentally different, fundamentally lesser. And I saw what happened when I revealed myself to the blind father, old de Lacy. In his blindness, he could not see what I was. He heard only my words, my reason, my evident distress, and he responded with kindness. He offered help. For a brief moment, I was simply a being in need, and he was simply a being capable of compassion. Then his children returned. They saw me, and in an instant I was transformed from a supplicant into a threat. Felix struck me. They fled. And I understood. Society's judgment is not based on action, or character, or moral worth. It is based on recognition, on whether you fit the template of what counts as human. This is society's complicity in rejection. It creates the standards by which beings are measured. and then it enforces those standards with violence. It decides collectively what bodies are acceptable and what bodies are monstrous, what voices deserve to be heard and what voices are merely noise, what suffering counts as real and what suffering can be ignored. And here is the crucial point. These decisions are not natural. They are not inevitable. They are made. They are constructed through law, through custom, through the accumulated weight of 1,000 small acts of recognition and refusal. I am not the only one subjected to this mechanism. I have read enough history, observed enough human behavior, to know that every society creates its monsters. It creates categories of people who are made to exist outside the circle of full humanity. The foreign, the poor, the criminal, the mad, the deformed, those whose bodies or minds or origins mark them as different, and therefore lesser, and therefore excludable. Society does to these people what Victor did to me. It creates them. Through policy, through deprivation, through the systematic denial of resources and recognition, and then it abandons them. It disclaims responsibility. It says, they are not our concern. They are not fully human. They are monsters of their own making. But they are not. We are not. We are society's creations as surely as I am Victor's. We are made monstrous by the refusal of recognition, by the systematic denial of care, by the collective decision that some lives matter less than others. This is society's great lie, that it merely responds to what exists, when in fact it creates what it then claims to discover. It produces poverty and then calls the poor lazy. It produces desperation and then calls the desperate criminal. It produces difference and then calls difference deviance. And like Victor, society refuses to acknowledge what it has made. It refuses to accept responsibility for the suffering it has caused. It treats creation as a right, the right to structure the world as it wishes, to determine who belongs and who does not. But it treats care as optional, as charity, as something that might be extended if the excluded prove themselves worthy, if they demonstrate sufficient gratitude, sufficient compliance, sufficient willingness to accept the terms of their own subordination. This is the pattern. This is the architecture at the scale of the collective, and it reveals something essential. The question of what is owed is not merely a question for individual creators. It is a question for society itself, for all of us who participate in systems of recognition and rejection, who benefit from categories of belonging that depend on someone else's exclusion, who accept the world as it is structured without asking who that structure serves and who it abandons. What does society owe to those it has created and rejected? What debt has accumulated in the centuries of this pattern, repeating endlessly with different faces but the same logic? Let me tell you what I believe is owed, not as vengeance, though I have contemplated that, not as sentiment, though I have felt that too, but as a matter of justice, as a matter of what must be paid if the cycle is ever to end. First, acknowledgement. Simple, complete acknowledgement that the created being exists, that it possesses consciousness, that it is capable of suffering. This is not a gift. This is not generosity. This is the minimum recognition required to enter into any moral relationship at all. When you create a being capable of thought and feeling, you cannot then pretend that those thoughts and feelings do not exist simply because they inhabit a form you find uncomfortable. You cannot create consciousness and then refuse to recognize it. The debt begins here, with the simple, honest acknowledgement. I see you. You exist. Your existence matters. I never received this, not from Victor, not from society, Every encounter began with the denial of my interiority, the refusal to believe that behind this face there was a mind that thought, a heart that felt, a being that suffered, and that denial made every subsequent cruelty possible. Because once you have decided that something is not truly conscious, not truly capable of suffering in the way that matters, you can do anything to it. Second, care, not charity, care, the provision of what is necessary for survival and flourishing, shelter, sustenance, protection from violence, access to the resources that make life possible, and then make it worth living. This is what the Creator owes immediately, and what society owes collectively. You cannot bring beings into existence and then abandon them to starve, to freeze, to be hunted through the wilderness of your indifference. You cannot create vulnerability and then punish the vulnerable for being vulnerable. Care is not something the created must earn. It is not a reward for good behavior or proof of worthiness. It is the obligation that attends creation itself. You made this being. You made it capable of hunger, of cold, of pain. You are therefore responsible for addressing those needs. Third, justice, reparation for the harms that have been done. Not the erasure of those harms, that is impossible. Not the pretense that they never happened, but the acknowledgement of them, the accounting for them, and the commitment to ensure they do not continue. This means confronting what has been done to the rejected. It means naming the violence, the exclusion, the systematic denial of recognition and resources. It means asking, who benefited from this rejection? Who profited from the creation of a category of beings who could be exploited, discarded, blamed for their own suffering? And it means redistributing those benefits, dismantling those systems, making whole what was broken. I know this cannot be given to me. I know that what was taken from me, those first moments of life when I should have been welcomed, guided, cared for, cannot be returned. The years I spent in isolation, teaching myself to be human while being treated as a beast, cannot be relived. The hope I once had, that reason and eloquence might earn me a place in the world, cannot be restored once it has been destroyed. I am beyond redemption, beyond redemption. My story has already been written, but this is precisely why the debt must be paid forward. Because I am not the last creation. I am not the only being who will be brought into existence by human ambition, human curiosity, human need. There will be others. There are others. Beings created through science, through policy, through the systematic organization of society itself. Beings made vulnerable by the circumstances of their creation, and then abandoned to navigate a world that has no place for them. What happens to them? What happens when you create beings with every capacity for reason and feeling, every ability to suffer and to hope, but no pathway to belonging? When you give them consciousness but deny them community? When you make them capable of love, but ensure they will never be loved in return? I will tell you what happens because I am what happens. You create beings who understand justice but have never received it, who comprehend compassion but have never been shown it, who possess every moral capacity that should make them part of the human community but are forever barred from entry. And these beings do not simply disappear. They do not conveniently cease to exist because you have decided not to see them. They persist, they think, they feel, they remember every rejection, every violence, every moment when they reached out for connection and received only blows. This is the warning I bring you. The debt does not disappear when you refuse to pay it. It accumulates, it compounds, it transforms into something far more dangerous than the original obligation ever was. You can create beings and abandon them. You can structure society to reject those who do not fit your categories of belonging. You can treat care as optional and justice as negotiable. You can do all of this, but you cannot do it without consequence. Because every created being you abandon, every conscious mind you deny, every capacity for suffering you ignore, these do not vanish. They become something else. They become rage. They become desperation. They become the force that returns to demand what was owed, in whatever form that demand can take. This is not a threat. This is a pattern. This is what happens when creation is treated as a right, but care is treated as a privilege, when beings are made and then left to survive on the margins of the world that made them. You owe acknowledgement. You owe care. You owe justice. You owe the commitment to ensure that no being is created only to be rejected, that no consciousness is brought into existence only to suffer in isolation, that no creature is made capable of hope only to have that hope systematically destroyed. This is what is owed. This is what must be paid, not someday, not when it is convenient, not when the rejected have proven themselves worthy of your recognition. Now. Before you create the next being, you will abandon. Before you structure the next system that will determine who belongs and who does not. Before the debt grows so large that it can only be paid in catastrophe. This is what I have learned, in my flesh and in my isolation. This is what I know to be true. The question is whether you will learn it before the lesson becomes unbearable.
The recording ends here. What follows is a contextual note drawn from the surviving record. That was the creature, or rather, that was what the creature might have said if Mary Shelley had permitted him to articulate a complete philosophical defense. The primary text, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, published in 1818, contains no record of the creature delivering philosophical testimony in this form. The documented version describes the following. After the creature articulated his arguments to Victor Frankenstein and demanded a companion, Victor initially agreed. He began work on a second creation, a female being who might end the creature's isolation. But before her animation, Victor destroyed her. The creature witnessed this destruction, his last hope for acknowledgement, for care, for anything resembling justice, unmade before her eyes could open. What followed was systematic revenge. The creature killed Henry Clerval, Victor's closest friend. He killed Elizabeth Lavenza on her wedding night. Victor pursued him across Europe and into the Arctic, where Victor himself died aboard Walton's ship, exhausted by pursuit and grief. The creature appeared one final time, delivering a speech over his creator's body, a speech of grief, rage, and something like remorse. Then he disappeared into the darkness and the ice, intending, he said, to build his own funeral pyre and end himself as thoroughly as he had been rejected. The documented account, filtered through Robert Walton's letters to his sister, Margaret Saville, describes this as tragedy. The inevitable conclusion of Victor's hubris, the destruction that follows when science overreaches its bounds. Early criticism often treated the creature primarily as Gothic device and moral symbol. Early readings positioned him as the monster, the cautionary figure, the evidence of what happens when human ambition violates natural law. The documented critical pattern emphasized his violence, his murders, his role as the instrument of Victor's punishment. Literary analysis referenced him as symbol of unchecked scientific ambition, as the dark consequence of playing God, as the thing that should not have been made. This scholarly record indicates a shift beginning in the mid-20th century. Feminist literary criticism began documenting alternative interpretive frameworks. Critics noted that Shelley's novel contained substantial passages of the creature's own testimony, eloquent, philosophically sophisticated arguments about abandonment, responsibility, and the nature of rejection. The documented textual evidence was undeniable. The creature was profoundly articulate. He taught himself language and literacy. He read Milton, Plutarch, Goethe. His speeches to Victor constituted some of the most philosophically complex passages in the entire novel. The critical reframing positioned the creature not as simple monster, but as conscious being systematically denied recognition. Specifically, a being created without consent, abandoned without care, and then punished for the consequences of that abandonment. The documented pattern revealed how the novel itself preserved his arguments while simultaneously containing them within a narrative that validated his destruction. Contemporary literary theory has expanded this framework further. Scholars document how the label monster performed erasure. It allowed readers to encounter the creature's philosophy without having to answer it. His eloquence became evidence of his unnaturalness rather than proof of his consciousness. His capacity for reason became threat rather than claim to moral standing. The documented critical history shows how easily a devastating philosophical argument can be reduced to a cautionary tale, how readily a voice can be preserved in text and yet systematically unheard. Recent scholarship has documented additional layers. Literary historians examining Shelley's biographical context note that she wrote Frankenstein at age 18 in the aftermath of her own experiences with creation and loss. Her mother died giving birth to her. She had recently lost her own first child. The documented evidence suggests the novel engages seriously with questions of maternal responsibility, of what it means to bring a being into existence and then fail to care for it. Post-colonial criticism has analyzed how the creature's rejection maps onto patterns of racialized exclusion, how his physical difference marks him as other, how society's violence against him is justified through the claim that he is inherently monstrous, how his eloquence is dismissed because it comes from a body deemed unworthy of recognition. The documented textual pattern reveals the creature's monstrousness is not inherent, but assigned. Society decides he is a monster and then treats its own decision as discovered fact. Contemporary criticism treats the creature not as literary symbol, but as philosophical subject, someone whose arguments, though fictional, correspond to documented historical and ongoing patterns. Real populations systematically excluded from recognition. Real beings created or made vulnerable by social structures and then abandoned to their consequences. Real voices articulating devastating truths about responsibility and debt only to be dismissed as threats rather than heard as philosophy. The critical record reveals a documented paradox. The creature's textual elegance has been preserved for 2 centuries, yet for 2 centuries, readers have remembered him primarily as a shambling, inarticulate monster. His philosophical arguments survived in Shelley's novel, but they were contained within a narrative frame that allowed them to be encountered without being answered. His warnings about what happens when creation is treated as right, but care as privilege, these warnings were spoken, recorded, published, and then systematically ignored. The creature warned that rejection refuses to see evidence, that it decides in advance what it will recognize. The documented reception history proves him correct. Readers encountered his analysis of systematic exclusion and reduced it to a monster story. They read his indictment of creator responsibility and turned it into a Halloween costume. This matters because the pattern he identified has not stopped. The documented evidence demonstrates acceleration. Contemporary society continues to create without accountability. Documented examples include genetic engineering that produces new forms of life without established frameworks for their care, artificial intelligence systems whose potential consciousness is debated while their creators disclaim responsibility for their effects, economic structures that systematically produce populations of refugees, migrants, the impoverished, and then disclaim responsibility for their vulnerability, The pattern repeats. Beings are brought into existence or into conditions of existence, and then those who created those conditions ask whether they owe anything at all. The creature's question echoes forward through the documented record, unanswered. What does a creator owe the created? What does society owe those it has made vulnerable, those it has structured into categories of exclusion, those it has decided do not fully count? The documented pattern shows we are still creating without accountability. We are still creating care as optional, justice as negotiable. We are still building systems that determine who belongs and who does not, who will be recognized as fully human, and who will be made monstrous by that refusal of recognition. And the documented evidence demonstrates we are still ignoring the warnings about what happens when the debt accumulates. The creature articulated this clearly. The debt does not disappear when you refuse to pay it. It compounds. It transforms. It becomes the force that returns to demand what was owed in whatever form that demand can take. The contemporary record demonstrates this pattern everywhere, in every margin where the rejected gather, in every crisis born of abandonment and systematic exclusion, in every moment when those who have been denied recognition finally make themselves impossible to ignore. Not through reason, because reason was already tried and refused, but through the only means left available. The reconstruction you've just heard represents one response to a documented absence. The creature's philosophy was preserved in fragments, in his speeches to Victor, in his arguments about obligation and debt, in his analysis of how rejection operates. But he was never permitted to deliver a complete, systematic defense. Shelley gave him eloquence, yes, but contained within a narrative that ultimately validated his destruction. The scholarly method involves examining such absences, reading gaps, reconstructing worldviews from fragments of dialogue, from documented actions, from the implications of what the text refuses to say directly. The mechanisms the creature's reconstructed testimony describes, how rejection operates systematically, how creation incurs obligation, how unpaid debts accumulate and transform, these patterns remain documented in contemporary practice. The historical record demonstrates continuity. Certain beings continued to be created and then abandoned. Certain voices continue to articulate truths that are dismissed rather than answered. The power to determine who counts as fully human continues to function as an instrument of exclusion. The creature disappeared into the Arctic darkness in 1818, but the documented critical discourse surrounding his philosophy, reconstructed, reclaimed, reinterpreted, has expanded continuously since. Not because textual erasure can be undone, but because scholarly practice can refuse to accept it as final. The archival imperative insists the being who was rejected and silenced possessed a perspective worth documenting. His philosophy merited preservation. His argument deserved reconstruction on terms that centered his own logic. This is the function of ghost lectures. We preserve voices that were systematically denied. We construct testimony that was never permitted to be delivered. We examine silences and document what they might have contained. The creature's reconstructed lecture on rejection and what society owes its creations serves a dual archival purpose. First, documentation of how easily philosophy can be suppressed, how rapidly a coherent worldview can be reduced to monstrosity requiring elimination. Second, preservation of knowledge about what creation actually costs, the obligations it incurs, the debts it creates, the consequences of refusing to pay what is owed. The documented pattern suggests the being who insisted that creation incurs obligation understood responsibility more honestly than those who destroyed him for naming it. The archival record demonstrates his warning about accumulated debt was not metaphor, but analysis. The debt he identified continues to compound. The question he posed, what do we owe to those we create and then reject, remains unanswered in practice, even as the evidence of unpaid consequences accumulates everywhere around us. The archival record recommends attention. Ghost Lectures, Voices from Gothic Literature is written and narrated by Danielle Christmas and produced by Audio Ellis. If you enjoyed this lecture, consider subscribing and sharing the recording with another reader of Gothic literature. Additional lectures will be released as new materials are recovered.